If you are new here, understand this. You are not watching content for entertainment anymore, you are entering a different way of thinking. And for those who have been here longer, your mind is already beginning to detach from the patterns most people live inside without noticing. Before anything continues, enable subtitles. Not for accessibility, but for precision. Some ideas here are meant to land slowly, not emotionally. Now stay with this, because what you think is your personality might actually just be your default mindset repeating itself every day without challenge. And success, real success, not the version sold to you online, does not begin with action. It begins with 5 internal mindsets that quietly separate people who rise from people who repeat their life. But here is what no one tells you up front. Most people already know these mindsets, they just live in a way that actively contradicts them every single day. And that contradiction is where failure feels normal. There is a reason 2 people can be given the same opportunity, the same environment, even the same intelligence, and still end up in completely different realities. It is not talent, it is not luck, it is not even discipline at first. It is mindset, but not the motivational version of mindset people repeat online. These are deeper, more uncomfortable, and in some cases, they quietly expose the way you have been thinking without ever questioning it. Let's begin with something most people avoid admitting. The first mindset is this. You are not behind. You are delayed by your own interpretation of time. Most people walk through life as if success is something they are late to. As if there is a hidden schedule they missed while everyone else got ahead. But that belief is already a silent form of defeat. Because when you believe you are behind, you stop acting like someone building. You start acting like someone catching up. And that shift changes everything. A person who is building moves with patience. A person who is catching up moves with anxiety. One builds structure, the other builds pressure, and pressure without structure always collapses. Think about how this shows up in real life. Someone starts a skill. After 2 weeks, they feel behind. After 1 month, they compare themselves to people who have been doing it for years. And without realizing it, they stop learning and start rushing. Not because they lack ability, but because they misread time. Time is not working against you. Your perception of it is. And this is where most people never recover. Because once you believe you are behind, every small delay feels like proof. You stop measuring progress in growth, and start measuring it in comparison. That is not ambition. That is psychological distortion, and it quietly destroys consistency. There is a shift that changes everything, but it is not comfortable to accept at first. You are not competing with people ahead of you. You are only responsible for your trajectory from where you started, not where someone else is standing now. When that clicks, urgency changes shape. It stops being panic, it becomes direction, and direction is what builds momentum. But there is something deeper underneath this first mindset that most people miss. Because even if you accept time differently, there is still another force that silently controls behavior. And it is far more dangerous than feeling behind. It is identity inertia. The second mindset is this. You do not rise to your goals. You fall to your identity. Most people assume success is about adding more habits, more routines, more discipline. But they ignore something more fundamental. You can only act consistently within the limits of who you believe you are. If your identity is unstable, your behavior will be inconsistent no matter how motivated you feel in the moment. This is why people can be extremely productive for 3 days, and then disappear into old patterns for weeks. It was never a discipline issue. It was an identity conflict. A part of them tried to act like a disciplined person. Another part still believed they were someone who struggles, delays, or negotiates with comfort. And identity always wins, not because it is stronger, but because it is familiar. Familiarity is more persuasive than logic. You do not change by forcing behavior first. You change by making old behavior feel like it does not belong to you anymore. That is the shift most people never consciously make. They try to do better, while still thinking like the version of themselves they are trying to escape. And that creates internal resistance. You can see it clearly in small moments. A person says they will wake up early. They set the alarm. They mean it. But when the moment arrives, there is a negotiation inside their mind. Just 5 more minutes. That voice is not laziness. It is identity protecting itself. Because waking up early would require them to temporarily become someone they do not fully believe they are yet. And the mind resists unfamiliar identity before it resists effort. This is why willpower fails under pressure. It is not designed to override identity long term. It only creates temporary spikes in behavior, which collapse back into identity default. So the real question is not, how disciplined are you? It is, who do you believe you are when no one is watching? And there is something unsettling about that question. Because most people already know the answer. They just avoid naming it clearly. But here is where the real transformation begins. Not when you add more effort, but when you stop negotiating with an identity that no longer serves your direction. And this is where success becomes less about action, and more about refusal. Refusing to act like the version of you that survives instead of the version that builds. There is a tension building here that most people ignore in their own life. Because even if you fix time perception and identity conflict, there is still a deeper layer operating underneath both. A hidden framework that decides how you interpret everything you experience. And if this is misunderstood, everything else becomes unstable again. Which leads into something most people never question at all. The third mindset is coming, but before that becomes clear, there is something you need to notice in yourself. The moments you already chose comfort over direction, and justified it so smoothly that it felt reasonable. That justification is not logic. It is pattern recognition working against you without resistance. And this is where the next shift begins to reveal itself. But not yet, because understanding it too early makes it feel like advice. And this is not advice. It is exposure. And what gets exposed next is the difference between people who understand success intellectually, and people who structurally become it without needing constant motivation. We will continue from here. There is a quiet correction that needs to happen before anything else makes sense. Because if you are still thinking success is mainly about effort, you are already operating inside a limited model of reality. Effort is visible, but it is not decisive. What decides outcomes long before effort is applied is interpretation. And that leads into the third mindset. You do not experience life as it is. You experience life as you interpret it under pressure. Most people assume they are reacting to events. In reality, they are reacting to meanings they assign to events without noticing. Two people can experience the same setback, same timing, same loss, same rejection. One collapses mentally for days. The other adjusts and continues without internal disruption. The difference is not emotional strength. It is interpretation structure. One sees the event as a stop. The other sees it as data. And that single shift quietly determines long-term trajectory more than motivation ever will. Because motivation depends on emotional alignment. But interpretation determines emotional response itself. And most people never question their interpretations. They accept them instantly as truth. For example, failure happens. One person interprets it as, I am not good enough. Another interprets it as, this method was incorrect. Same external event, completely different internal reality, and over time, those interpretations compound into identity. This is where success becomes almost invisible at the beginning. Because it is not changing what happens to you. It is changing how quickly you recover meaning after something happens. That speed of recovery is what separates momentum from stagnation. But there is a deeper layer. Most interpretations are not consciously chosen. They are inherited from environment, from past experiences, from repeated emotional patterns that were never questioned. So when something new happens, your mind does not analyze it fresh. It retrieves an old emotional template and applies it automatically. Which means most people are not living in real time. They are living inside recycled interpretations of the past. And that is why change feels harder than it should. Because you are not only dealing with the present situation. You are also fighting every previous meaning your mind has attached to similar situations. Now here is where the shift becomes uncomfortable. Because if interpretation controls emotional reality, then your current life is partly built from meanings you never consciously chose. And that raises a difficult implication. You are not just changing habits. You are rewriting meaning itself. And meaning is what gives events emotional weight. Without meaning, failure is just information. Rejection is just redirection of context. Delays are just time displacement. But the mind resists neutral interpretation. Because emotional charge feels like truth. This is why people cling to stories about themselves even when those stories are damaging. I always fail at this. I am not consistent. I never get lucky. These are not facts. They are repeated interpretations that became emotionally familiar. And familiarity feels like certainty, even when it limits you. Now notice something subtle. Most people try to improve by adding more action while keeping the same interpretation structure. So even when they succeed temporarily, they collapse back into old meaning patterns. Because nothing changed at the level that actually decides emotional reality. There is a moment where this becomes obvious. When someone finally achieves something they wanted, but still feels the same internally. No satisfaction, no shift in identity, no stability, because they never change the interpretation system that assigns value to achievement. So success arrives, but it lands on an unchanged mind. And it does not integrate. It fades quickly. That is why some people keep chasing new goals without ever feeling like they have arrived anywhere psychologically. They are upgrading outcomes without upgrading interpretation, which leads to a strange cycle. More achievement, same emotional structure. More progress, same internal instability. Now there is a deeper consequence here that most people never consider. If interpretation is automatic, then most emotional suffering is not caused by reality itself. It is caused by how quickly the mind assigns meaning before awareness catches up. Which means the gap between event and interpretation is where control exists. Not in stopping events, but in interrupting automatic meaning. And this is where discipline becomes something different entirely. Not force, not suppression, but delayed interpretation. A moment where you refuse to accept the first meaning your mind offers. Because the first meaning is almost always shaped by fear, past experience, or self-protection. Not accuracy. And this is where a quiet form of power begins to develop. The ability to let events remain undefined long enough for truth to form instead of emotion. But there is something even more structural beneath interpretation itself. Because even if you master meaning, there is still a system deciding what you focus on in the first place. And what you focus on determines what you even have the chance to interpret. Which means there is another layer still controlling everything silently. And most people never notice it because it feels like personality. But it is not personality. It is selection. And selection determines reality more than effort ever will. This is where the fourth mindset begins to form. But before that is revealed, notice something. Right now, your mind is already filtering parts of this and emphasizing others. Without permission. That filtering process is the next level. And it is far more controlling than most people realize. We continue from there. There is something happening in your mind right now that most people never become aware of. You are not absorbing everything equally. You are selecting, and that selection is shaping your reality more than anything being said. This leads directly into the fourth mindset. You do not see reality. You only see what your attention is trained to prioritize. Most people assume they are observing the world objectively. In reality, they are experiencing a filtered version of it, shaped by what their mind has been conditioned to notice, ignore, or dismiss automatically. This is not imagination. It is cognitive selection. Two people can walk through the same environment and live in completely different psychological worlds. One notices opportunity, patterns, leverage points, social signals. The other notices limitation, discomfort, comparison, and threat. Nothing externally changes, but internally, they are not in the same reality. And the mind does not randomly select what to focus on. It prioritizes what has been repeatedly reinforced emotionally and behaviorally. If you repeatedly focus on fear, your attention becomes tuned to detect threats faster than possibilities. If you repeatedly focus on discipline, your attention starts detecting structure where others see chaos. And over time, this selection becomes automatic. Which means most people are not consciously directing their lives. They are following pre-trained attention pathways. And this is where success begins to quietly separate itself from average living. Because success is not only about what you do. It is about what you consistently notice before you act. If your attention is low quality, your decisions will always reflect that limitation. You cannot build clarity from a chaotic attention system. And this is why some people feel stuck even when they are trying harder. They are applying effort, but their attention keeps defaulting to distractions, emotional reactions, and irrelevant comparisons. so their energy is constantly being drained before it ever becomes direction. Now here is where it becomes more precise. Attention is not neutral, it is trained, and it is trained through repetition, emotion, and reinforcement. Every time you react emotionally to something, you strengthen the likelihood that your mind will prioritize similar stimuli in the future. Which means what you repeatedly react to becomes what you repeatedly notice. And what you repeatedly notice becomes your lived reality. So the question is not just what you are doing. It is what your attention has been trained to automatically select without your permission. This is where discipline becomes something more subtle. Not forcing focus, but interrupting automatic focus patterns. Because if you do not interrupt them, they will continue running in the background even while you try to change your life consciously. This is why people can set goals and still sabotage themselves. Their attention is still loyal to old patterns. And loyalty is stronger than intention. Now there is something even deeper beneath attention. Because even attention is not fully random. It is guided by a core internal reference point. A silent internal identity filter that decides what feels relevant, what feels threatening, and what feels worth noticing. And that brings everything to the final mindset. The fifth one. The one that quietly determines whether all the others stabilize or collapse again. But before that is fully understood, notice something important. As this message continues, your mind is already evaluating whether this applies to you or not. That evaluation itself is part of the system being described. Because the mind always tries to preserve its current structure first before it accepts restructuring. And that resistance is exactly where transformation either begins or stops. The final mindset is not about effort, interpretation, or attention alone. It is about something more fundamental. Identity direction, where your internal self is actually moving when no one is influencing it. Because everything else flows from that. And if that direction is not consciously chosen, it is always inherited from past conditioning. Which means most people are not moving toward success. They are moving away from discomfort without realizing it. And those are two completely different trajectories. One builds, the other avoids, and only one of them compounds. Now the final shift begins here. But understanding it properly requires seeing something most people avoid. That your current life is not just a result of what you want. It is a result of what your identity repeatedly defaults to under pressure. And pressure reveals direction, not intention. This is where everything converges. The 5 mindsets are not separate ideas. They are layers of the same system. Time perception, identity alignment, interpretation control, attention selection, internal direction. And once these align, discipline stops feeling like effort. It becomes consistency of identity. Not performance, but structure. Now the silence after this matters more than the words. Because at this point, there is only one real question left. What version of you is actually being reinforced by your daily patterns when you are not trying to improve? Not the version you imagine. The one you are repeatedly becoming. And that answer is already visible in your smallest decisions. Not your goals, your defaults. And that is where everything either changes or repeats. If you understood even part of this, do not treat it as information. Treat it as a mirror. Like this video if you are willing to question your default patterns instead of defending them. Comment one word only. Structure, if you are choosing direction over repetition. Share it with someone who is still living on autopilot without realizing it. And subscribe, not for content, but for reinforcement of a mindset built on discipline, awareness, emotional control, and psychological clarity. Because what comes next is not motivation. It is continuation of awareness that most people avoid long enough to remain unchanged. And now, continue forward. Do not break the chain. Move into the next lesson.